Hello chess family, it's me, National Master Jesse James, and today we're going to be taking another look in logical chess games, and this time we're going to be taking a look at O. Bernstein versus Mises in 1904. This is a very cool game in Sicilian where Mises really understands the endgame. That's why I went ahead and chose a quote with Jose Capablanca saying, learning the endgame first is very important and very instructive if you want to become a good chess player. So, Bernstein is going to be playing with the black pieces, and Mace is going to get some weak squares in the opening from the Sicilian, believe it or not, and is going to go ahead and transpose that into an endgame win with the very fun idea of going into opposite color bishop endgame. For those of you who don't know, Bernstein's actually famous for, during World War I, he was actually in a prison camp, and they were about to put him up against the firing squad. Apparently, one of the officers there saw that he was a chess enthusiast and challenged him to a game to save his life. Well, Bernstein, being a grandmaster, was able to win the game quite easily and was able to save his life that day. So that's one of Bernstein's crazy stories from the World War. And well, let's go ahead and take a look at this game. So here we go. E4, C5, Knight C3. This takes a look at these kind of close Sicilian ideas. Typically, they play this when it's anti-Sicilian, so G6 is to be recommended in a lot of these lines since white typically goes for a kingside attack. In this game, he goes ahead and plays pawn to E6, which I'm very fond of also. Knight F3, Knight C6, pawn to D4. Here we're going to go into the open Sicilian. C takes D4, Knight takes D4, and here it's recommended to go ahead and play something like Queen C7 and maybe even D6. The main idea is that we're trying to stop the pawn from getting to E5. Well, obviously the knight would take on E5 first, but as you can see in this game, there's a nice little trick to get the E5 move in. Bernstein goes ahead and plays Knight F6, and this is what gets him into trouble. Well, if we want to play pawn to E5, we got to get rid of the knight, and that's exactly what Mises does. He goes ahead and plays Knight takes on C6. We're going to go ahead and take back toward the center. And I don't think we want to go ahead and play D takes as this loses the right to castle. B takes on C6. And now we can get that move of pawn to E5. Well, after E5 gets played, where are you going to move your knight to? Well, the best square is going to go ahead and jump into the center with knight D5. Here's already your first question. What should we do in this situation? Should we go ahead and play knight takes D5 and give him some double pawns? Or put the knight to E4? Well, hopefully you made the right answer here and went ahead and played knight to E4. Knight takes D5 actually only helps black as it gets another pawn to the center. Although these are double pawns, black has a very easy time just going ahead and playing something like pawn to D6. And well, we're going to trade off this pawn, and white loses his only pawn in the center. So, for those of you who chose knight to E4, this is a very, very good and strong move here. Why so? Well, when we look at the position, we always look for weak squares. Hopefully you can see the weak square that black has in his camp. What square is that? It's the D6 square. Should be easy to point out as your pieces are already controlling that more than your opponent. Notice that white has two pieces controlling the square, while black only has one. Another good thing to point out, if you don't know what the weak squares are, or if we know that we're making progress, is from 5 and back, this is black's natural territory. From 4 and back, this is white's natural territory. So anytime we can start grabbing our opponent's territory, it's going to give us a good position. It's going to help get us our pieces in, and of course start an attack against them. So here the D6 square is very weak, and white's already threatening to play pawn to C4, kicking the knight away from the good center square, and adding another piece to control D6. And well, if you can't get your D pawn out, this bishop's going to have a hard life. You can already see when, well, I guess I can put it to B7. It won't really get a good life over here because, well, white's already controlling the C5 square and might even control it more, especially after something like C4. Bishop A6, you know, this is already controlled. We might try A5 here, but yeah, black should definitely try to get some better central control here. And this is why this E5 move is so devastating, not only in the Sicilian, but in many openings in chess. So, black went ahead and continued. Pawn to F5. A very drastic move, but a good idea. A lot of times when you're in a worse position, it's a good idea to complicate so that hopefully your opponent won't know what to do and they'll make a mistake. And that gives the opposition good chances to try and fight back. Unfortunately, here he's playing against the great Mises. And yeah, Mises definitely is able to take care of this game very nicely with good technique. Pawn takes, of course, here. I say, of course, some people may not understand why. Well, you can see here that the uh, once the knight's attacked, you don't really want to move it away anywhere because, well, black will be able to achieve his d6 ideas later on, and he has some good central control here. So we want to go ahead and take because, well, after knight takes back, we now see that there's lots of weak squares here. In fact, d6 is still very weak here, and that's exactly what Meneses plays. Here we're going to go ahead and play knight to d6 check. Either we're going to win the bishop, the dark square bishop, or we're going to stop black from castling. Black went ahead and played the best move. Bishop takes, queen takes. I mean, anytime you can get the queen to d6, or vice versa, black getting their queen to d3, this is just going to stop the bishop from getting out. If the bishop can't get out, the rook has a hard time getting out. And of course, there's no central control here. So, black plays a decent move. He goes ahead and plays knight to e4 here, attacking the queen. And queen to b4 gets played, retreating and always making a threat. Pawn d5. And now a simple move here. Let's develop with a threat. Bishop d3, just threatening to win the pawn. Here, of course, black is having some problems here. The queen b4 move is so strong because, well, it's stopping black from castling. And, well, it's stopping black from making progress in general. So black makes a very interesting move here. Bernstein, I don't really like this idea as this goes into technically a losing endgame. And he goes ahead and plays queen to d6. Typically, endgames can be a little hard to play, but we got two really weak squares here that Meneses is able to take control over. So, yeah, just not a good idea here. Of course, Meneses is very excited. He goes ahead and plays queen takes, knight takes. If you go ahead and assess this position, what would you think here? How is white doing? How is black doing? Let's go and start off with white. Well, white in this position should be very happy. You can see all their pawns are on the side. Some people might think this is, or all the pieces have not been moved. Some people might think this is a bad thing, but this is actually a good thing. There's no weaknesses in white's position at all. Another good thing, white has the bishop pair, and white has the right to go ahead and maybe bring the king to the center or castle to either side. So the options are very open here. Black does have the knight, this bad bishop, and we know this is bad because, well, the pawns are on the same color. Black can castle over here, and black is actually hoping to achieve e5, e4 here. In this position, if he can get that, he actually would have a decent position. That goes into white's plan here. White has two weak squares that they're going to put pressure on to stop black's expansion. And we already mentioned that black really wants to play this e5, e4. So what are the two weak squares here that we want to control? One of them is going to be the e5 square, of course, because, well, we don't want that to happen, right? e5, e4, we see the bishop gets out, and, well, black has a lot of space in the center. Where's the other weak square that we're going to try to get control over? The c5 square. How do we know? Well, again, black might even have ideas about c5, c4. If we can't go e5, well, maybe we can go c5, c4 to create counterplay and also grab space. These are the two weak squares here, and Meneses knows this and takes advantage of them right away. How would you take advantage of this e5 square right now? Would you play bishop to f4, or would you play pawn to f4 here? Again, both these moves are going to control the e5 square and stop the expansion. Well, hopefully you chose the right move. Pawn to f4. This is a very nice move because it takes control of the square and it's not going to be losing control of the square for a long time. Once pawns are placed somewhere, they usually stay there for quite a while, right? And this pawn is not going anywhere. It's going to keep constant access to this e5 square. So f4 is a very good move here. Black plays pawn to a5. You can see here he's going to try and trade off this light square bishop as, well, this is just the worst piece on the board here for black. If black could choose, he'd probably choose his dark square bishop because the dark squares are so weak here because he can fight over them. Yeah, here he just wants to trade off the bishop. And this is a very good and practical decision for him, as the bishop has the bishop pair. Once you trade the bishop for the other bishop, they lose that advantage, and then it becomes the knight versus bishop, that argument of which one is going to be better in the position. So, white goes ahead and takes control of that second weak square, which was c5, and we're going to go ahead and play bishop to e3 here, bishop to a6. Of course, we don't want to just trade right away. Here, a very nice move. What would you play here in this position to keep bettering your position? king to d2, a very nice move. In endgames, we do not need to castle, and it's not even needed. The king is actually heading for one square in particular. We won't mention that just yet, as there's still a lot of things to look at in this game. But king d2 is a very good move. The king wants to be in the center so we can take advantage of some of the weak squares over here. Mainly these ones right here. But there is definitely a best square for this king. Well, king d2 gets played, and Bernstein makes a very nice decision here and plays knight to c4 check. Now this is a very good move for a few different reasons. It's definitely going to bring an imbalance to the position, but here, well, white's pretty much almost forced to take. I mean, if you do not take, and let's just say you play something like king e2, I mean, I guess I can just take a pawn, but even better, we'll probably just play something like knight takes c3 here. Just trade off all the pieces here, and with the dark square bishop gone, now we can maybe look about playing c5, c4 here. Black will have a very good position if he can achieve this, and definitely getting rid of this dark square bishop, which is the best piece on the board for white, is definitely going to help you out with that. So, well, knight c4 check, and here we have to go ahead and take, and this was Bernstein's idea. Now we have what's called the opposite color bishops. Now, this is very good for Bernstein if he's trying to play for a draw, and because he knows he's in a worse position, he's definitely playing for. And, well, the game is not over yet, though. Although we do have the opposite color bishops, anytime we have rooks or queens on the board, these actually help the attack for the opposite color pieces that we're going to be attacking. Obviously, black's going to be trying to attack the light squares, and white's going to be trying to attack the dark squares. And when you have these rooks here, it's extra power that we can do it. And of course, we can't defend the same color squares, and that's where the imbalance becomes aware. Now, if Bernstein can trade off the rooks, then this most likely will become an endgame. So this is, you know, a short term for his long-term planning. Make trades here, hopefully get the rooks off the board, and then get a draw. Maisis does not let that happen and chooses a very nice move here. He's going to make this bishop just one of the worst pieces on the board, and he starts off with pawn to a4. Now this is a good move for two different reasons. Not only does this take away squares for the bishop to move to, but it also keeps this pawn on the dark square. Why is this important? Well, with a pawn on the dark square, this bishop will have constant harassment over this pawn, and if you win this pawn, well, this will become a pass pawn and become very important and probably become a winning factor in the game. So a4 is a very nice move here. Typically what you want to do is put your pawns to the opposite color, but here Maisis knew that he wants to play against this bishop and make it terrible, so he's actually going to be using his pawns on the light squares on the queen side to harass this bishop. Here black plays king d7, following all the rule book from Maisis over here of trying to make your king better. And now let's go ahead and harass this bishop once again. Pawn b3. This bishop is just doing terrible. No good squares to move to. Bishop a6 gets played, and now a masterful move gets played here. What do you guys think? What would you play in this position? Here Maisis keeps making this bishop worse and worse. All right, hopefully you found a move. You know, a lot of people here will probably say something like rook e1, maybe g4 here to start pushing on the queen side, the king side, which is not a bad idea. But here, the masterful move that gets played in the game is this beautiful move, bishop to b6. Now this looks like a strange move. What does it do? Sure, it attacks the pawn, but we can easily defend the pawn. The problem with defending the pawn is, well, we're going to have to move this bishop, and where do you move the bishop to? One of the great things about b3, a4, it took away those squares. The bishop really has nowhere good to move to. He can either go to b7, where it's blocked, or it goes to c8, where it's even worse, right? It's a king and a pawn are in the way. Ugh. Well, he goes ahead and plays it. Bishop to c8 here. It's the only way to defend your pawn and not give your opponent a pass pawn. Here, black is definitely having a hard time, right? Every piece on the back row, there's no squares for it to move to. And now Maisis keeps bettering his position. What do you do now? Here, I mentioned before, we wanted to get our king to the best square. Where is the best square here for white to move their king to? Is it c5, d4, or e5? You want to put as much pressure as possible, and the best place is going to be e5. Now, there's a few different reasons why we want to go to e5, so let's go ahead and go over those. e5 is going to be the best because it puts pressure on the e6 pawn. You might say, well, what's the difference between putting pressure on the c6 pawn? This goes into the second reason why, or the second weakness in the position that he's going to be creating. We have 1, 2, 3 good pawns over here ready to be pushed against these two pawns over here. When these pawns get moved forward, this king will have access into black's position to penetrate and put more pressure on these pawns. This is the typical two weakness principle. You know, we have some dark square weaknesses. This is not enough to win the game, but by putting pressure over here on the king side pawns, that's the second weakness, and that is how Mises was able to win the game. So let's go ahead and keep it going. King e3. Notice the good technique here. Whenever you're playing in these games and your opponent has a bishop on the light squares, it's good to stay on the dark squares. You know, if you play king d3, maybe bishop a6 gets played. You know, you just don't want to deal with these kind of issues. So a good rule of thumb, just stay on the opposite color so you won't have to worry about this bishop. So king to e3 got played. Rook a6 trying to harass this bishop. Here black apparently does not have any good ideas and actually helps out white here. Well, black might have tried something like king to d6, although this won't work too much. Here black's idea is to try and play c5 and maybe trap the bishop, but the big thing is to try and get control over the dark squares. Unfortunately, white just has a killer move here. Hopefully you see it. King to d4, and we're going to play bishop c5, just kicking this king back. And yeah, black's king is going to be forced to the light squares, or maybe even c7, but again, they're not able to push these pawns forward. These pawns are just a liability. These are blockaded pawns that just can't make any headway. So that's the idea here for black. And so when he plays rook a6, you know, where do we place this bishop to? Should we go to c5 here to block the plan of king to d6? Or maybe should we play bishop d4 and attack this pawn over here on g7? Hopefully you're paying attention. Of course we're going to play bishop to c5 here and block it. Remember, our king wants to get to d4 to e5 to put harassment on the e6 pawn. Yes, the pawn is being defended, but we want to put constant pressure. Whenever you put the king over here, now the king has to stay or the bishop has to stay here. We want to keep the pieces tied down. And that's the reason why this bishop g7 move is not, I mean, the bishop to d4 attacking g7 is not too good. Here, black would simply just look about playing maybe something like rook g8 or, and you know, play g6 next move. To be honest, he doesn't even have to even defend this pawn. His bishop takes rook g8, rook takes g2, and the game would actually be very, very problematic for white, as black has now created counterplay. So, bishop to c5, a very strong move here gets played. You can see how the dark squares are just so bad here for black, and he's really doesn't have many squares to move to. King to c7 gets played, mostly, I guess, like a waiting move and opening up this bishop. King d4, just battering the king. Bishop d7, and now rook to e1. A very nice move. Before putting our king to e5, rook e1 gets played. What is the idea behind this rook to e1 move? Now, it's hard to find the idea if you don't know the plan. What is white's plan here? Do you remember? We got the first weakness, which is, well, we're going to be putting pressure, and we're going to put the king over here to put more pressure over here. But first, we want to get our rooks active, and we want to make a new weakness. Where's the weakness we're going to attack? It's the king side pawns. Remember, if we can start putting pressure over here, we can get access because the pawn moves forward, and now you see e5 and f6 is opened up for us to move into. Also, the rook will put pressure on the pawns. So you can either play rook e5 to g5, or maybe even rook e3 to g3. Both of these ideas are pretty nice. Here, black plays a very bad move, a weakening move. He plays pawn to h5. He's following the rules of, well, it's good to put your pawns on the same color as your bishop. Unfortunately, here, this rule does not do good because, well, the bishop, if it was outside the pawn chain, would have been great. But since it's behind it, he's really just trapping his own piece. What do you guys think? Should we go rook e3 or should we go to e5? I definitely like this move, rook e5, putting pressure on the pawn and getting ready to slide over to g5 here to put pressure on the g7 pawn. One of the ways that we're able to beat weaker opponents is to provoke or create weaknesses. Remember, your opponent doesn't want to make weaknesses by themselves, so by bringing the rook over here and putting pressure on the pawn most likely will be pushed forward, and that's when the dark squares become even weaker. Pawn g6 gets played. Let's slide this rook over here. Rook goes to g8, and now you see we've gained access in here. And this king is going to slide right in and put pressure on the g6 pawn. Here, there really is no good defense. At this point, it's really just a matter of technique. White has plenty of moves, even just to kind of wait around and provoke more weaknesses, and definitely better ideas with their pieces than Black does. I mean, Black is just kind of moving around in the back, and they can't make their pieces good. There's only one open file here that they can try to use, which is F8, but that's a little hard to get to. They'd have to orchestrate like Rook to F7, and man, that's going to take quite a few moves. That might have been probably the best idea. Maybe something like Rook A8, Rook G7, Rook to G8, and then Rook to F7. Look how long that takes. But that probably would have been a good idea here. Well, White is just going to go ahead and continue. King to E5. Look at that king. It's getting ready to jump into F6 and attack the G6 weakness. Bishop E8. The king can take over here on E6, but we really want to try and win this G6 pawn. The difference between winning E6 and G6, what is it? Why would we rather win this pawn than this pawn? Well, if you win the E6 pawn, well, what happens? What do you get out of this? I mean, you win a pawn, which is good, and you probably might be able to use it later. But if we win the G6 pawn, now we've got ready to we got a candidate pass pawn, which will hopefully become a pass pawn. For those of you who don't know, a candidate pawn is a pawn that has no pawn in front of him, but there is one to the side. But it's very simple. You just go ahead and play like your pawn to like H3, G4, and well, once the pawns are traded off, there will be a pass pawn here, whether it is the G pawn or it is the H pawn. And that's how you're going to be winning this game. You've got to create that pass pawn. So the pawn on E8 is okay, but again, not the pawn on E6 is okay, but not really the one that we're trying to win. Here, a very nice move. Rook to E1, getting all the pieces as active as possible. Here we're going to be trying not only to win the pawn, but actually trying to get the rook active on the 7th rank. Rook to A8, king to F6, putting pressure on G6, but again, the idea now is to play rook takes on E6, and then the rook can try penetrating and really becoming very annoying over here. Again, if we can win this A5 pawn, now we got a pass pawn over here. Too many weaknesses. Bishop D7 was played. And what do you play here? Hopefully you did not take the pawn on G6 here. Here, another very masterful move, pawn to G3. What? If you don't understand this move, it's because you're not calculating. Here, rook takes G6 is bad. Not losing, but bad. Why is this so bad? Uh-oh. If rook takes, king takes, rook to G2 check gets played. You can take the pawn on H5, but again, you're just making your life harder on yourself. You went from like a +5 advantage to a 0.5 advantage, and now you see this rook has become active, and it's going to be attacking the pawns. You do have this one pass pawn, but you know it's always nice to have two pass pawns so they can work together, especially when you're winning pawns for free. So Maíz saw this. Of course, it doesn't take right away. Pawn to G3. Now this one's looking weird move now makes total sense. G3 is allowing us to play rook takes G6 without losing our G pawn. Rook to E8 got played. Rook to E5. A very nice move. Again, this is Capablanca style chess right here. Take your time. You are in no rush to win this position. A lot of times, if you're playing against a good opponent, your opponent will simply just resign. They understand who's in charge of this game. It's a very nice psychological ploy too. Rook E5 makes plenty of sense though. After rook takes, we got pressure on the H5 pawn. There's no need to waste any time at all. We can keep building and building our position, and your opponent has to sit there and watch you as you just get better and better. This is just devastating to them. Black played rook H8, saying there's no good way to defend. Rook takes on G6. Rook to H7, and a very nice move here. Rook to G7. A nice idea here is, of course, to make trades. And you want to be a little careful here. There are two rooks on the board and a bishop, so there could be some kind of mating pattern. Let's not even deal with these kind of possibilities. I always like to play my games with the two type of result. Either I win or I draw. And with the move like rook G7, this is only really going to help us out for the winning situations and not going to allow them any kind of perpetual ideas. So, rook to H8 gets played. Rook takes, rook takes. What do we play now? King to G6. Rook H8. And what do we play now? Hopefully you didn't fall for it. Whenever your opponent is in a losing position, they will look for all the traps. They will look for everything in the position that is not losing. So hopefully you did not play rook takes h5. Do not get into that autopilot mode. You got to be looking at your opponent's threats the whole time. Here, if you played rook takes h5, bishop e8 check, and you're going to look a little embarrassed now with the chessboard. Your opponent's going to be very happy, but you're going to be quite embarrassed, and you're not going to feel good about yourself after this. So take your time. Again, here, the nice easy move. King to g7, not allowing any checks. Rook comes over. Rook takes on h5. Bishop e8. Rook h7. At this point, it's really just a matter of technique. Although, even if we went back to the opening whenever they traded queens, at that point, at the highest level with grandmasters and even masters, they even call those games of technique. This was all, there's plenty of weaknesses in the position. The e5 and c5 square were so critical in winning this. I mean, look at these. Look at this. It looks like it's nice because it's you know, a little pyramid right here. But because we controlled the squares in front of it and did not let them expand, it just does not do anything. Rook takes h7 was played. Rook d7 check. King to h6, and rook takes, king takes. This is a very good practical decision for black, but against his strong opponent, this doesn't do too much. By trading off rooks, there is ideas of maybe getting a draw. And Bernstein does a good try in trying to do that. But here, calculation and just a better position makes it pretty easy here. Bishop h5, pawn to h4, past pawns must be pushed. Bishop to d1, the light squares are all being attacked. There's a few different ways to play this, but Maisis has already calculated this, so he can let all these pawns fall. There's really no need to let all of them fall, but you know, a win's a win. Pawn to c3, bishop takes on b3, and now pawn g4. These pawns are obviously a lot faster than these pawns over here. Even if these pawns do become passed, this bishop is over here defending. Bishops are very good at endgames because they can stop pawns pretty easily. King to d7. Oh, the other good factor here is that the king is actually controlling the queening squares. That's another good thing to point out. Pawn to g5, pawn to e5, and, well, should we play f5 here, or should we take on e5? Which one do you think would be better, f5 or taking on e5? Hopefully you found it. What's better than one passed pawn? 3 passed pawns. 2 obviously also. If you do take on e5, you'll still be winning, but you can see black can go ahead and blockade this. And yeah, it's just getting a little annoying here with some of the moves. So this makes it a lot easier because, well, our passed pawns can be pushed. And notice they can even really make progress because our bishop is controlling the square. So now we have these 3 beautiful passed pawns. Very simple game here. Bishop takes, pawn to f6, and there's no stopping f7, f8. Hope you guys enjoyed this game. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I'm doing videos pretty much every week now. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please let me know. Remember, this game was about square control, making the weaknesses, and good endgame technique. I'll see you guys later.